So I've been looking at your comments. Why doesn't DW criticise Germany's economy for a change? Never mind the fact that we've been doing that for a while. And here we are to do it again. What is Germany getting wrong in its competition with China? Germany used to be a world leader in engineering and manufacturing, but it's now starting to fall behind China. That's according to a new report by Brad Zetzer from the Council on Foreign Relations, who joins me now. Brad, how bad are things for Germany right now?
Well, to be honest, things are pretty bad. They've been not great for a while. Germany's economy hasn't really grown strongly for many years. Industrial production is down. And Germany's auto industry is not exporting as many cars as it used to. And the German auto industry is really central to the German economy. So Germany has undeniable strengths. But this is a serious challenge to Germany and the German economic model.
Okay, well, I don't know if you've seen this meme. I'm going to show it on the screen now. So we've got this Venn diagram. The US is tech dominant. China is dominant in cutting edge industry. Europe is dominant in regulation. That's what the meme says. I'm not saying that that's true, but what do you say? Is Europe at risk of becoming just a consultancy for foreign nations, for foreign firms?
I mean, there's an element of that meme that comes pretty directly from the Draghi report and the argument that European attitudes towards regulation have impeded the development of something akin to the U.S., what we call the technology industry. It was actually big platforms as much as technology. But I think it actually, that like most memes, really oversimplifies. Europe unambiguously right now leads in civil aviation, aircraft. Boeing has made a series of missteps. Airbus leads in narrow bodies, has excellent wide bodies. The 350 is a very good plane. It's at the technological cutting edge. And that's the kind of strength that Europe should actually build on, not ignore. European wind technology is very good. There's an issue around cost, but not around technology. Vestas and Siemens are manufacturers of top-of-the-line, efficient wind turbines. And I think, maybe German electric vehicles lag on the consumer entertainment side compared to China. The European automotive sector lags on batteries a bit compared to China. But I would actually put money on Europeans' diversified EV industry over, say, Tesla, in part because Tesla actually hasn't been investing that much in putting out new models. They're sitting on a aging portfolio, whereas the German manufacturers are actually generating a pretty impressive array of new product offerings. So I wouldn't discount all of Europe's traditional strengths.
Right, and we've also got ASML, which is making the equipment for chips. We've got Novo Nordisk, this massive pharma firm which makes Ozempic, which has just been huge. Nokia making 5G equipment, which is used all around the world. I mean, there are these key companies there. But I want to get
let me just throw in a quick joke here.
Sure.
I think of Apple as a European company. They're generate the bulk of their profit in Ireland. So I view Apple as an Irish company with a U.S. design subsidiary. And the major U.S. pharmaceutical companies now make almost all of their drugs in Ireland. So don't discount how significant Europe is to the success of some American companies.
Absolutely. It's got so much there, but it needs to then work on its strengths, and especially with industrial policy, which is what you're talking about a lot in this report. And we'll dig into that, especially with your suggestions. So what Germany should do. So among the suggestions, Germany should support EU protection of vulnerable parts of industry. It should set up new subsidies, and it should encourage the EU to come up with a single policy and work together. And there should be more public investment. But let's look at this proposal first. So I'll quote here. Germany should abandon its past opposition to the scrutiny of large trade surpluses, basically because China exports so much it overwhelms foreign markets. So, Brad, after decades of Germany doing exactly the same thing, to the complaints of many of its European neighbours, exporting a lot more than it imports, except for one brief blip in 2022, now that Germany's losing, it should change the rules of the game. Is that your suggestion?
To be blunt, yes. Look, Germany has to, and I think Europe has to, change the narrative a little bit. Little less true for Germany, but if you look at Europe as a whole, Europe's trade is actually much closer to being in balance in aggregate than China's is. It's actually not at all close. And if you take away the pharmaceutical surplus, which is a lot tied to tax avoidance, Europe's global trade is pretty close to now being in balance. Germany, of course, has a surplus, but there's some deficits elsewhere. Germany imports as well as exports. China basically now just exports. So I think Europe and Germany need to think a little bit differently about where they are in the global economy. They are no longer the big surplus economy. That was true 5 or 10 years ago. That is now China. China's manufacturing surplus has grown by $1 trillion since 2019, since 2020, since COVID. Europe's manufacturing surplus has gone down, if you exclude pharmaceuticals. There just isn't equivalence between China and Europe, or even equivalence now between China and Germany. So I actually think, yes, it is now time in international institutions like the G20, like the IMF, for Germany to join together with the United States and France. I will do a little asterisk that Trump sometimes will make cooperation hard, if not impossible. But in principle, join together with Germany, with France, with the United States, with the UK, and put pressure on China. It's in Germany's current interest. And I think there's a misconception about how unbalanced Germany's economy is. There's certainly a misconception about how unbalanced Europe's economy is. Europe's economy is much, much closer to balance than China's.
Okay, and now to quote one of your other suggestions, Germany should support EU protection of viable European industrial sectors facing an onslaught as a result of China's active industrial policies. But it's hard to see how they're viable if they need artificial support. But anyway, isn't it rather up to Europe to find its new champion industries rather than trying to put essentially dying industries on life support, even if they are dying because of competition from elsewhere?
Look, it is ultimately Europe's choice. But I think it would be an enormous mistake to view electric vehicles as a dying industry, to view wind turbines as a dying industry, to view hydrolyzers creating hydrogen gas as a dying industry, to view heat pumps as a dying industry. Europe is still potentially competitive in all those sectors with additional investment. We do differentiate a bit with solar, where there is a big lag and it'd be very costly to catch up with China. But in these other sectors, Europe is not lagging in technology. They're lagging in cost competitiveness to a degree. And I think there's an important and more general point, which is that the equation of protection with a dying industry doesn't match China's actual experience. China built its EV industry with protection. China has high auto tariffs. Used to be 25, now the applied tariff is down to 15, but that only came down after China already was overproducing. It was built, its auto sector, behind a protective wall. China never has allowed an imported car or an imported battery to qualify for its subsidies. It doesn't allow open and unfettered access to its markets. China has, in addition to protection, industrial policies. China built its capacity to make wind turbines and turbines cheaply by giving Chinese producers preferential access to China's grid. As well as some forced technology transfer from Vestas, or encouraged technology transfer from Vestas. So I simply don't accept the premise that protection, if done well, some barriers to allow these new clean industries to develop, and some subsidies to encourage their development in Europe will produce uncompetitive industries. China's experience says that if done well, this is necessary to create competitive industries. And at this point, because China's built a lead, I think it's necessary for Europe to be in a position to catch up. Maybe Europe will fail, but I have a hard time believing that 10 years from now, it would be in Germany's interest or Europe's interest for China to be the sole supplier of EVs to Europe, or the sole supplier of batteries to Europe, or the sole supplier of wind turbines to Europe. That doesn't make sense industrially. It'd be an enormous shock to employment, and it would create a level of dependence writ large that I think should worry policymakers in Europe, but also, frankly, in the U.S. I'm not on the same side as Donald Trump, so I think a strong Europe actually makes America.
Okay, so instead of waiting for China to come up with the level playing field, which is what the EU has been asking for a long time, it should use the same kind of tactics that China has been doing, because otherwise it'll just fall behind.
I couldn't have said it better myself. We in the U.S., under both parties, have concluded that the playing field in China will never be level. And I think that's a reasonable judgment.
Okay. So you also say that Germany should get the rest of the EU round the table to come up with a proper unified industrial policy. So, of course, on the face of it, that absolutely makes sense. But won't Germany find it difficult after years of throwing its weight around at EU level, such as opposition to the supply chain law at the EU level and many other examples, not to mention that some European countries are benefiting from Chinese investment, so there's a disincentive for them to join in with whatever proposal Germany might have?
I actually think right now Europe is eagerly awaiting a bit of German leadership. I certainly think the Commission would welcome German leadership. Von der Leyen has been pretty forward-leaning here. A German willingness to expand the resources available to the Commission to pursue common industrial goals would be a game changer. And I think it is unlikely that a country like Hungary, which is not doing that well economically either, would stand in the way of policies that stand to benefit everyone in Europe. And then I think, there are difficult questions that are associated with those industrial policies. But at least in my view, if there's real technology transfer, if there's real investment, if it's a real European supply chain, some of that European supply chain can, in fact, be built by Chinese firms. I'm more worried about BYD making the EV and controlling the driving system than I am about BYD and CATL making the battery, particularly if the battery is made in Europe using chemicals that are sourced from around the world, but that aren't running through China. So I think there are ways those that are more pro-China will still be able to benefit. But I think it is essential that Europe develop its own industrial strategy. And one of the things we suggest in the paper is that Europe can do a lot more to harmonize national strategies. So one of our suggestions is that essentially you have common European standards for what constitutes an EV that qualifies for a European subsidy from any European government. And those standards would be developed in such a way that effectively they wouldn't extend to China. They wouldn't extend to Chinese-made EVs. They would just apply to any EV made in Europe. And the French have kind of come up with ways of doing this. And what that does is it assures an internal European market that is coherent, even as individual countries provide their own subsidies to EV adoption or their own subsidies to other consumer clean technology purchases. So there are ways to make this work.
But it sounds like that requires an ideal world. So politicians that think sensibly about economic policy rather than putting ideology first. Does that not throw a spanner in the works? Because, of course, the whole point of the EU is to try and come to some common decision making, and that has just that is the constant refrain in the EU, right? How do we get everyone on board, and that it is a very difficult task. But it seems to be perhaps now more difficult than ever.
I would just maybe turn it around and say it's now more necessary than ever. It is easy to allow divisions to persist, to not reach consensus when everything is going well. But things aren't going well. Things aren't going well for Germany's industry. Germany's auto industry is shrinking. VW is laying off people. Hungary isn't doing that well either. If you take away the bright spots, Irish Pharmaceuticals, Airbus, which has the only limit on the amount of planes that it can sell is how many it can make, there are real problems. The wind industry in Europe is technologically very solid, but demand has fallen off, and there's some of the producers are in trouble. So I think it's time for Europe to realize that it's not too late to build on its strengths and to pursue a set of policies that position Europe to compete effectively with China in clean technology sectors. This is not beyond the scope of capacity. I mean, as an American, it's a little difficult for me to admit, but now that Boeing's probably going to need a bit of help, maybe it's easier. But Europe came together to put together the Airbus consortium, and the Airbus consortium is now the world leader. So it's not quite a common European policy because it wasn't done through the EU, and it included the UK, and it didn't include a lot of others. But there are examples of successes, not just of failures.
Okay, but isn't the worry, though, that if Germany and the EU start being tougher on China, that'll lead to more restrictive conditions for European businesses there, some of which make a big chunk of their profits in the country, even if growth has slowed?
Well, let's be honest. They used to make a lot of profit in Germany. In China. In VW, obviously. That profit is shrinking. The competition is going up. Market share is going down. But yes, VW does worry that being tougher on imports from China will lead China to be tougher on VW's production in China. I think Europe here has to be pragmatic. It has to value VW's production in Europe more than it values VW's production in China. And it has to be willing to go to China and say, because it's actually true, that the policies that we would put in place are actually just mirror images of a lot of the policies that China's already had in place. Is China really going to retaliate if Europe introduces de facto buy European preferences to its electric vehicle subsidies? When, as I mentioned earlier, China never has qualified an imported electric vehicle or an imported battery for any of its subsidies. It's completely symmetric. China has a higher auto tariff, bound auto tariff, and an applied auto tariff than Europe does. So I think, VW went to China in part because of Chinese tariffs. So I actually think the Chinese will be a bit more pragmatic, A, and B, that VW's success in China will largely be determined not by what the EU does in Europe, but by what VW does in China. How, if it can compete effectively with the very aggressive new Chinese competitors who themselves are facing difficulties making money. There's a bloodbath coming within China's EV industry because of a lack of profitability outside of BYD and one other company. So I think it's time for Europe to prioritize production in Europe over the profits of European firms on their Chinese production.
Okay, so it's time for Germany and the EU to wake up and smell the coffee. I couldn't have thought of a better expert to talk to us on this. Brad, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us on this.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks so much for giving me a chance to put some of these ideas out into the public debate.